Welcome to Nighttime Biographies. Tonight we follow the life of Dwight D. Eisenhower, the quiet Kansas boy who became Supreme Allied Commander during World War II, led the D-Day invasion, and later served as the 34th President of the United States. On the morning of March 28, 1969, the ward at Walter Reed Army Medical Center was quieter than usual. Spring was beginning to soften the air outside, but inside room 8016 the world had been reduced to something very small. The sound of a laboured breathing, the low hum of monitors, and the presence of family members who had gathered close because they sensed, finally, that the end was near. Dwight David Eisenhower was 78 years old. The body that had once radiated such extraordinary physical energy, that sturdy, square-shouldered Kansas frame that had led armies across continents and shaken the hands of heads of state, was exhausted. He had been in this hospital for 9 months, 7 heart attacks in all, surgery after surgery. Each time the doctors had shaken their heads, and each time he had recovered, and each time the world had exhaled with relief. But there would be no more recoveries now. Everyone in the room understood this, and they had settled into the particular stillness of people waiting for something irreversible. Mamie was there, the woman he had married 53 years before on the first day of July, 1916, a young second lieutenant marrying a vivacious girl from Denver who had saucy eyes and a way of laughing that made a room feel warmer. His son John was there. His grandson, David, was there. David had recently married Julie Nixon, daughter of the man who had served under Eisenhower as vice president for 2 terms and had now, in what seemed an almost cosmic turn of events, become president of the United States. The generations were present. The story was complete. Eisenhower had been drifting in and out of consciousness for days, but now he was awake and clear. He was always most himself near the end of things. His mind, observers noted throughout his life, remained sharp and precise even as his body deteriorated. He had been a general for too long to lose his faculties at the wrong moment. He gave his final orders. He asked the doctors and nurses to lower the window shades. He asked to be raised to a sitting position in the bed. He took Mamie's hand. He looked at his son John, and then at his grandson David, with the steady blue-grey eyes that had once been described as the calmest eyes in any room. Then softly he spoke his last words, "I want to go. God take me." And Dwight Eisenhower was gone. Consider what that moment contained. The man who had planned the largest amphibious invasion in human history, the man who had commanded nearly 3 million Allied soldiers, sailors, and airmen across the beaches of Normandy on the 6th of June, 1944, issued his final command to God. Not a surrender, an order. Even in dying, he was still the general. Even in dying, he retained that unshakable quality that those who knew him best simply called Ike. Before you drift towards sleep tonight, I want to tell you this man's story from the beginning. Because Dwight Eisenhower did not begin as a general. He did not begin as a president. He began as a poor boy in Abilene, Kansas, in the closing years of the 19th century, in a small house where 6 brothers shared a bed, and a hard-working mother read the Bible by lamplight, and taught her children that hatred was a waste of a perfectly good life. If you find this story enriching, I hope you'll stay with us. But for now, let us go back to the beginning, back to 1890, back to the plains. To understand Dwight Eisenhower, you must understand the moment into which he was born. The year 1890 was a hinge in American history. It was the year the United States Census Bureau formally declared that the western frontier had closed. For nearly 300 years, the idea of free land to the west had defined the American imagination, the sense that if things got hard here, You could always go further, find new ground, start again. That idea died in 1890. The country was filled from coast to coast. There was no more frontier. The era of expansion had ended, and an era of consolidation had begun. The Industrial Revolution was thundering forward. John D. Rockefeller had built Standard Oil into a monopoly of staggering proportions. Andrew Carnegie was transforming the steel industry. The railroads had stitched the country together, and the great industrial cities of the Northeast were growing faster than any human settlements had ever grown before. In the same year that Dwight Eisenhower entered the world, Ellis Island opened in New York Harbor and began processing the flood of European immigrants that would reshape the American character. Thomas Edison had electrified parts of Manhattan. Alexander Graham Bell had wired the country with voice. The machine age had arrived. But out on the plains of Kansas, none of this was immediate. Kansas existed in a different America, an America of hard soil and hard weather, of communities bound together by necessity and faith, of men who worked with their hands and women who kept the household running through circumstances that would test anyone's reserves. Kansas was frontier country that had only recently stopped being frontier. The cattle drives from Texas up the Chisholm Trail had made Abilene famous, or infamous, in the 1870s as a wild town at the end of the long drive where cowboys drank and gambled and fought. By 1890, those days were over. The town had settled into quiet respectability, a small agricultural community of perhaps 4,000 souls, surrounded by the flat, vast, beautifully plain Kansas landscape that stretches us every direction until it meets the sky. This was the world Dwight Eisenhower would call home. Not the roaring cities, not the industrial centers, the plains, the small town, the simple life. He would carry it with him everywhere he went, to West Point and Panama and France, and the Philippines and London and Washington, and back again, always returning in his heart and finally in his body to that flat horizon and that quiet Kansas sky. It is worth pausing for a moment on what Abilene represented in the broader American story. The town had grown up as the end point of the Chisholm Trail, the great cattle route that brought longhorns from Texas north to the Kansas Pacific Railway, where they could be loaded onto trains and shipped east to the slaughterhouses of Chicago. Through the 1870s, Abilene had been a wild and violent place. Cattle drovers and gamblers and dance hall girls and men with guns arriving in waves every summer at the end of the trail. The famous Marshal Wild Bill Hickok had kept order there for a time, or attempted to. The reputation of Abilene in those years was not one that respectable Kansas farmers much appreciated. By 1890, all of that was over. The trail drives had ended. The railroad had moved on, finding new cattle towns further west. Abilene had settled into the quiet life of an agricultural community, with its newspaper and its churches and its school, its civic associations, its slow seasonal rhythms of planting and harvest. The cowboy years had left behind a certain mythology, a sense that Abilene was a place where things happened, where history had paused briefly. But the daily reality was much more ordinary. Farmers and their families, small businesses, the railroad bringing goods in and grain out, the flat, enormous Kansas sky above everything. This was the actual world into which Dwight Eisenhower was born. Not the mythological West of gunfighters, but the real West of farm families trying to survive and sometimes thrive in a demanding landscape. Kansas was not gentle country. The winters could be brutal, the summers ferociously hot, the thunderstorms spectacular and occasionally deadly. Drought was always a possibility. The soil was productive but unforgiving of poor management. People who lived there learned early that nature did not accommodate weakness. His father, David Jacob Eisenhower, was a man of considerable intelligence, who had, through bad luck and bad choices, ended up in circumstances far beneath his abilities. David's family had settled in Pennsylvania in the 18th century, members of a German-speaking religious community called the River Brethren, pacifist people of deep faith who believed in plain living and hard work, and keeping a distance from the corruptions of the wider world. David had grown up with these values and then made a decision that the community regarded with disapproval. He had gone to college. He attended a small institution called Lane University in Lecompton, Kansas, where he studied and met a young woman named Ida Stover. They married in 1885. David had dreams, he had ambitions, he had studied engineering, he was going to be something. But a business partnership went wrong. David invested everything he had in a small general store in Hope, Kansas, and the venture failed entirely, leaving the young couple not just bankrupt but in debt. It was a humiliation from which David never entirely recovered. The man who had wanted to be an engineer, who had attended college with plans for a different kind of life, took a job shoveling coal and cleaning engines for the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad in Denison, Texas. He lived in a tiny house near the railroad tracks with his wife and his growing family. The neighborhood smelled of coal smoke and machine oil. The wages were minimal, the future was unclear. It was there, in that small house in Denison, Texas, on October 14, 1890, that Dwight David Eisenhower was born. The third of what would eventually be 7 sons: Roy, Edgar, Dwight, Arthur, Earl, Milton, and one son, Paul, who died of diphtheria in infancy. 7 boys in a house with modest means, and a father who had swallowed his pride and taken whatever work was available. The name Dwight was somewhat unusual. His parents had originally planned to name the third son David, after his father, but a brother was already called that in the family's informal system, and so they chose Dwight, after a popular evangelist of the era, Dwight L. Moody. The middle name David was added in honor of the paternal name. He would be called Dwight by formal acquaintances for most of his life, but among family and friends from very early on, he was Ike. The nickname came from the Ike ending in Eisenhower, and quickly became the name by which most of the world would eventually know him. From the Kansas schoolyard to the beaches of Normandy to the White House, he would always be Ike. When Dwight was a year and a half old, his father got a better job. David's brother-in-law ran a creamery in Abilene, Kansas, a dairy processing facility where milk was turned into butter and cheese, and he offered David steady employment. The family moved back to Kansas, to Abilene, to a small house on South 4th Street that would become the center of Dwight's world. Abilene in the 1890s was a quiet, decent working-class town. It had a main street with shops and a newspaper and a few churches. It had a school. It had a clear division between the north side, where the families of some means lived, and the south side, where the railroad workers and laborers and poorer families made their homes. The Eisenhowers were firmly South Side residents. This was a fact that would matter in small but significant ways to the boys growing up there. There was a certain rivalry between North Side and South Side that expressed itself in the particular way of small-town America, through football games and occasional fights, and a sharp awareness of who had more and who had less. Dwight's mother, Ida, was in many ways the most remarkable figure of his early life. She was a Virginia woman, born Ida Elizabeth Stover in Mount Sidney, Virginia, in 1862, in the Shenandoah Valley. She had grown up in the Civil War era, a child shaped by the knowledge of what armies did to landscapes and families. Her family were pacifists. The devastation wrought by soldiers passing through her region had only deepened her conviction that violence solved nothing. She joined the River Brethren community, as her husband's family had, and kept the faith of her childhood, quiet, steady, deeply personal, and absolutely opposed to the institution of war. Which means that Ida Eisenhower, pacifist and woman of profound religious faith, raised the man who would plan the greatest military invasion in history. She raised a soldier, not because she wanted to, she wept the day Dwight left for West Point, but because she believed, above all other things, in the right of each person to find their own path. She never tried to dissuade him, though the choice pained her. She simply loved him and let him go. The home she kept was orderly and warm and full. 6 boys required a great deal of feeding, and the family managed its 3-acre property with the efficiency of a small farm operation. Each boy was given a section of the garden to tend and sell from. The proceeds were theirs. This was not an abstract lesson in economics, but an immediate one. If you wanted money for anything beyond bare necessities, you grew it, or you worked for it elsewhere. Dwight took this lesson deeply to heart. He was known around Abilene as a boy who would take almost any available job. He sold vegetables door to door. He worked at the Bell Springs Creamery where his father was employed, working overnight shifts loading and hauling. He hauled ice in summer. He did whatever was available and kept what he earned. The house on South 4th Street was small for such a large family. 2 bedrooms for 8 people, the parents in one, all the boys eventually rotating through arrangements in the other. There was an outdoor privy until the family eventually connected to indoor plumbing. The kitchen was the heart of the house, where Ida cooked everything from scratch, and the boys gathered in the mornings before school. The meals were simple but substantial: fresh bread, vegetables from the garden, whatever meat could be afforded. The family kept chickens. In lean seasons they kept a pig. Nothing was wasted. What the house lacked in space or luxury, it supplied in something harder to quantify. There was structure, there was love, there was an absolute insistence on doing your best at whatever task was in front of you. The boys were expected to work, to study, to treat others with respect, and to control their tempers. This last expectation had a particular lesson behind it. As a young boy, Dwight had been furious one Halloween that he was considered too young to go out trick-or-treating with his older brothers. He had beaten his knuckles bloody against the trunk of a tree in his rage. His mother found him and nursed his bleeding hands and spoke to him quietly about the nature of anger, how it consumed the person feeling it, how it accomplished nothing, how the world did not care about his rage and only he suffered from it. Eisenhower would later say this was one of the most valuable lessons of his life. For the rest of it, he worked at mastering his temper, not always successfully, but always consciously. There is a particular quality to the childhoods of people who grow up with very little, but within communities of common purpose and shared values. They learn early that money is not the primary measure of a person, that reputation is built through work and honesty and reliability, that the opinions of your neighbours matter because you will need those neighbours when trouble comes. The Eisenhower boys grew up knowing all of this with the certainty that comes from living it rather than being told it. Their parents had almost nothing by material standards. They had 6 children and a small house and a garden, and the expectation that every member of the family would carry their weight without complaint. David Eisenhower was not an easy man. The failure of his business in Hope, Kansas, had left a wound in him that never fully healed. A wound of pride, of disappointed ambition, of the distance between the life he had imagined and the life he was actually living. He was not cruel to his boys, but he was distant in the way that men who have swallowed their dreams sometimes become distant. He worked long hours at the creamery and came home tired and expected order and discipline from his sons, without much demonstrating the warmth that might have made the discipline easier to bear. He prayed with the family from the River Brethren tradition, and he worked without complaint, and he was, by the standards of the place and time, a decent man. But he was not, in the recollections of his sons, the emotional centre of the household. That centre was Ida. Ida Eisenhower had grown up in Virginia during the Civil War, and its aftermath, in the Shenandoah Valley, where armies had marched through repeatedly, and the damage they left behind was visible for years in broken fences and burnt fields, and the faces of people who had lost too much. She had come to Kansas as a young woman with energy and ambition and faith, and she had built a household on those qualities. She read to her children. She taught them the Bible not as rote recitation, but as a living text, full of human stories that had things to say about how to be in the world. She played the piano. She kept order without harshness. She answered questions honestly, including hard questions about life and death and God, and she did not pretend to certainty she did not have. Her pacifism was genuine and profound. The sight of soldiers had frightened her as a child, and the knowledge of what wars did to the families she had grown up among in Virginia, had never left her. She could not reconcile the institution of armed conflict with her reading of the New Testament, and yet she raised 6 boys who were all physically strong and competitive and interested in the world, and when one of them wanted to become a soldier, she did not stop him. She understood that her values were hers to hold and not hers to impose. This was its own kind of wisdom. In the schools of Abilene, Dwight Eisenhower was not a remarkable student. He was bright, certainly. His intelligence was never in question, but he was not the kind of boy who stayed in at recess to study. He was the kind of boy who played every sport with tremendous intensity, who led games in the schoolyard, who was known as someone other children followed naturally without quite knowing why. He was the kind of boy who had friends easily, who could diffuse tension with a joke, who drew people toward him with a grin that his biographers would later spend considerable ink trying to describe accurately. The grin. It was by universal testimony extraordinary. Not just a smile, but an expression of such wholehearted pleasure in the world that it seemed to illuminate whatever room it entered. His whole face changed when he grinned. The blue-grey eyes crinkled at the corners, the forehead lifted, the entire face became a single declaration that life was worth living and people were worth knowing. He worked at this, later in life, with surprising deliberateness. He understood that leaders needed to project optimism even when they felt none, and he practiced his apparent ease with the same discipline with which others practice strategy. But the grin was real. The warmth was genuine. He actually liked people. He loved football with a passion that bordered on obsession. In Abilene he played everywhere and anywhere, with anybody who would play. He was solidly built, with broad shoulders inherited from the Eisenhower men, and the kind of physical toughness that came from years of outdoor work and outdoor play. He was not big by football standards, but he was fast and he was aggressive, and he had an unusual ability to read what was about to happen before it happened. A spatial intelligence that would serve him well in very different contexts later in life. History was the academic subject that genuinely captured his attention. He read military history with the focus he might have given to a novel he couldn't put down. He was drawn to the great commanders of antiquity, Hannibal crossing the Alps, Caesar's campaigns, the battles of the ancient world, and he read about them not as abstractions but as human beings making decisions under pressure. How did this general solve this problem? What would have happened if he had chosen differently? This was not bookish study for Dwight. It was the kind of active, engaged wondering that would characterize his thinking throughout his life. His older brother Edgar was his closest companion in childhood, though their relationship was as much competitive as affectionate. Edgar was a year older and significantly larger, and the two boys fought with a wholehearted commitment to physical combat that boys of that era and that neighborhood considered entirely normal. They also helped each other, covered for each other, and shared the dream that both would somehow get to college. A dream that seemed almost impossible given the family's circumstances, but which both boys held on to with the tenacity of those who have very little else to hold. By the time Dwight graduated from Abilene High School in 1909, a plan had formed. Edgar would go to college first and Dwight would work to help pay for it. Then Edgar would return the favor and help Dwight. It was a genuinely generous arrangement, the kind that speaks well of both brothers. Dwight spent a year working at the creamery, putting in long hours and saving money, and when Edgar was enrolled and the obligation fulfilled, Dwight began to think seriously about what came next. The creamery work had given him something beyond money. It had given him an understanding of operations, how large, complex processes functioned, how people had to coordinate across different tasks, how efficiency mattered at every point in a chain. He did not yet have the vocabulary for what he was learning, but the education was real. He was studying management without knowing he was studying it. It was at the creamery that he met a friend named Everett Hazlitt, who changed the direction of his life. Hazlitt had been pursuing an appointment to the Naval Academy at Annapolis, and was enthusiastic about the opportunities a military education could provide. A full academic training, completely free to those who earned appointment. For a boy from a poor family who could not otherwise afford college, this was extraordinary news. The military academies represented a path to education that did not require money. They required only merit and the right kind of political connection, a sponsor, typically a senator or congressman, who would nominate a candidate. Dwight applied to both the Naval Academy and West Point. He was 20 years old, which made Annapolis a year too old for enrollment, so West Point it was. He pursued a congressional appointment with methodical persistence, writing to Kansas Senator Joseph Bristow, who happened to be conducting a competitive examination process for his nominations, rather than simply distributing them as political favors. Dwight took the exam. He scored near the top. The appointment came. In the summer of 1911, Dwight David Eisenhower packed what little he owned and left Abilene for West Point, New York. His mother, Ida, who hated war, who feared soldiers, who had seen enough of what violence did to families, waited until her son was out of sight and then cried. She would say nothing against his choice. She simply loved him and prayed for him and waited. At West Point, Eisenhower was popular from the start and academically middling throughout. He ranked 61st in his class academically upon graduation. Decent, but unremarkable. What his grades did not capture was the quality of mind he brought to the informal education of the place. The endless discussions of military history and strategy, the arguments about what past commanders had done right and wrong, the absorption of a way of thinking about large problems that would define him. He was happy at West Point in the way people are happy when they have found their natural environment. He had arrived somewhere that fit him. He also played football spectacularly and briefly. As a halfback on the Army team, he was considered one of the most promising players in the country. Then, in a game against the Carlisle Indians team that featured the legendary Jim Thorpe, Eisenhower suffered a severe knee injury that ended his playing career. The disappointment was genuine and deep. He had loved the game more than almost anything. He would walk with the effects of that injury for the rest of his life, a trick knee that gave him trouble at the worst moments. He graduated in the class of 1915. a class that would later be called the class the stars fell on because of the extraordinary number of its members who reached general officer rank. Of 164 graduates, 59 eventually became generals. Something about the men who graduated from West Point in 1915 would prove equal to the extraordinary demands that history was about to place upon them. Eisenhower's first assignment was Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. He was a second lieutenant, 25 years old, making a modest military salary, stationed in a warm and pleasant city. His life at that moment seemed straightforward. He was a soldier. He would serve. He would advance in rank slowly as officers did in peacetime. He had no reason to expect anything spectacular. Then he met Mamie Dowd. She was 19 years old, the daughter of a prosperous Denver businessman who brought his family to San Antonio every winter for the milder climate. Mamie was small and lively, with dark hair cut short, sparkling eyes, and what Eisenhower would later describe as a saucy look about her face and her whole attitude. He was immediately captivated. She was surrounded by admirers, popular in the way that pretty, vivacious young women in small social circles always are, and her calendar was full for weeks. He asked for the first open date, which was several weeks away, and spent the intervening time getting to know her parents. By Valentine's Day of 1916 they were engaged. On July 1st, 1916 they were married. She was 19, he was 25. They would be married for 53 years. Their partnership would be tested almost immediately, and tested severely over many decades. The life of a peacetime army officer's wife in that era was one of constant movement, constant adjustment, constant resettlement. Mamie would later estimate that in their 37 years together before Eisenhower became president, she had unpacked and repacked her household more than 27 times. She moved with him to different army posts, different countries, different climates, always beginning again in a new place, always finding the social circles, always making a home out of whatever quarters the army provided. It required a kind of resilience that deserves its own recognition. The greatest test came early. On September 24th, 1917, their first son was born, Dowd Dwight Eisenhower, immediately nicknamed Icky. The child was the center of both parents' lives in a way that military people of that stoic generation might not have openly admitted but could not disguise. Icky was adored. He was bright and happy, with his father's coloring, and the junior officers at whatever post the Eisenhowers were stationed at that season immediately made him the unofficial mascot. One unit outfitted him in a tiny replica uniform. Eisenhower, newly promoted to major, coached the post football team and took Icky to watch the scrimmages, the boy running along the sidelines in his miniature military dress. At Christmas of 1920, stationed at Camp Meade, Maryland, Icky got sick, scarlet fever. In that era, before antibiotics, scarlet fever in a small child was a death sentence. There was nothing the doctors could do but quarantine him and hope. Mamie, also ill, was kept away from her son. Eisenhower sat with the boy through the nights, the man who would plan invasions, who would command armies, utterly helpless against the tiny microorganism that was killing his child. Icky wanted a tricycle for Christmas that year. The tricycle sat under the tree, untouched. On January 2nd, 1921, Dwight Eisenhower held his son while the child died. Icky was 3 years old. Eisenhower would write decades later, in his autobiography, that this was the greatest disappointment and disaster of my life, the one I have never been able to forget completely. Today when I think of it, even now as I write of it, the keenness of our loss comes back to me as fresh and as terrible as it was in the long dark days soon after Christmas 1920. From that winter forward, every anniversary of Icky's birthday in September, Eisenhower sent Mamie yellow roses, Icky's favourite colour. Every year for the rest of their lives, there are losses that don't go away. They simply become part of the landscape of who you are. Their second son, John Sheldon Dowd Eisenhower, was born in 1922. He would survive, thrive, follow his father to West Point, serve in the army himself, eventually become an author and diplomat. But John was never entirely free of the shadow that Icky cast, not because his parents loved him less, but because the grief of the first son's death was always present in the marriage, the quiet understanding between Dwight and Mamie of what they had endured and survived together. If Eisenhower's story were a straightforward tale of talent recognized and rewarded, it would be far less interesting than it actually is. The truth is that for nearly 2 decades after graduating from West Point, Eisenhower served in positions that offered no particular glory, in ranks that rose with agonizing slowness, doing his job excellently and waiting for something that showed no sign of coming. Between the 2 world wars, the United States Army shrank dramatically. The country had no appetite for large military expenditures in peacetime. Officers who had served with distinction in the Great War found themselves back in the junior ranks, promoted at a pace measured in years and decades. Eisenhower was a major for 16 years. 16 years. The work he did during those years was excellent. Everyone who worked with him noted his extraordinary organizational abilities, his intelligence, his way of keeping his temper when those around him lost theirs. But excellence in peacetime armies earns promotion slowly. He was patient, but the patience was not easy. The Panama posting from 1922 to 1924 turned out to be one of the most important experiences of his life, though it seemed unlikely at the time. Panama was not a prestigious assignment. The Canal Zone was considered a hardship posting, hot and humid and remote. But it was there that Eisenhower came under the mentorship of General Fox Connor. Fox Connor was, by all accounts, one of the most remarkable intellectual generals in the American Army. He had served as John Pershing's Chief of Planning during the First World War, and he had spent those years not just fighting but thinking, deeply, historically, carefully, about why wars happened, how they were won and lost, what made the difference between military genius and military competence. He believed that another world war was coming. He believed it with a certainty that most people in 1922 would have found alarmist, and he used his posting in Panama partly as an extended tutorial for the best young officers he could find. Eisenhower arrived in Panama as a capable but unremarkable major. Under Connor's guidance, he left 2 years later as something else entirely. Connor required Eisenhower to read widely, and then to discuss what he had read. Plato, Tacitus, Clausewitz, military historians and philosophers who had spent their lifetimes thinking about the nature of war. Connor assigned Nietzsche, and then asked Eisenhower to explain what it meant. He asked Eisenhower to study the campaigns of Hannibal and Genghis Khan and Napoleon, and then reconstruct the decisions, the alternatives, the moments where a different choice might have changed everything. It was, as Eisenhower would later describe it, the equivalent of a graduate education in military history and strategic thinking. Connor also said something to Eisenhower that he never forgot. The general predicted that the Peace of Versailles was too punitive to last, that Germany would rise again, that the next war would require the Americans and British to fight as genuine allies, rather than separate national armies loosely coordinated. He urged Eisenhower to study how alliances worked and failed, to read everything available about the failures of Allied coordination in the First World War. and to think carefully about what it took to command men of different nationalities and cultures toward a common goal. This was advice 2 decades ahead of its application. About Connor, Eisenhower would later write, "He is the one more or less invisible figure to whom I owe an incalculable debt." What Connor gave Eisenhower in Panama went beyond reading lists and intellectual exercises. He gave him a framework for understanding the world. He taught him to think historically, to see the current moment as a continuation of a long pattern, rather than as something entirely new and unprecedented. He taught him to ask, of any military situation, what are the deep causes at work here, the material and human factors that shape the possible outcomes? He taught him to read not just what the immediate facts of a situation suggested, but what the underlying dynamics would ultimately require. Perhaps most valuably, Connor taught Eisenhower to think about coalition warfare, about the specific human and institutional challenges of getting armies from different nations, with different military traditions and different national interests, to fight as a unified force. Connor had lived through the inadequacies of Allied coordination in 1917 and 1918, the constant friction between American, British and French commands, the communication failures and the arguments over strategy, and the inevitable tendency of each national army to protect its own assets at the expense of the common effort. He believed the next war would require something better, and he believed Eisenhower was the kind of officer who could deliver it. Eisenhower absorbed all of this with the intensity of a student who has suddenly found the curriculum that was made for him. The 2 years in Panama, which might have been a professional dead end in a second-rate posting, became instead the foundation of everything that followed. He left Connor's command a different kind of officer than he had been when he arrived. After Panama, Eisenhower pursued the education that Connor had recommended. He applied to the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, the most competitive professional development program in the Army, the gateway to the higher ranks of command. He graduated first in his class of 245 officers, not second, not third, first. The man who had graduated 61st at West Point in general academics graduated first among 245 of the Army's most capable officers when the subject was the professional practice of war. This achievement caught the attention of the Army's senior leadership, but it did not immediately translate into faster promotion or more prestigious assignments. He served on the staff of General John Pershing, working on a guide to American military cemeteries in France. Important work, painstaking work, the kind of work that built an intimate knowledge of the ground over which men had fought and died, but not exactly the work of which careers are made. Then he was assigned to the staff of General Douglas MacArthur. The MacArthur years, which lasted from 1933 to 1939, first in Washington and then in the Philippines, were a study in contrasts. MacArthur was a figure of theatrical brilliance, vain and imperious, a man who referred to himself in the third person and cultivated the trappings of military grandeur with the dedication of a stage actor. Eisenhower was the opposite, modest, collegial, self-effacing in manner if not in inner confidence. The two men disagreed frequently and fundamentally. MacArthur would later refer to Eisenhower dismissively as the best clerk who ever worked for me. Eisenhower would say, with some dryness, that he had studied dramatics under MacArthur. But MacArthur was also genuinely brilliant at certain aspects of military work, and Eisenhower learned from him as well as chafed under him. He learned how headquarters operated at the highest levels. He learned about the politics of command, how senior officers navigated the relationship between military necessity and political reality, how generals had to be not just warriors, but administrators and diplomats. He learned, perhaps most importantly, how not to lead, MacArthur's imperious style produced results in some circumstances, but alienated subordinates and peers in ways that made coalition command nearly impossible. Eisenhower filed this away. The Philippines assignment was particularly instructive in ways that neither man fully appreciated at the time. Eisenhower was being asked to help create a military force for a new nation from essentially nothing. Training recruits who had no military tradition, purchasing and organizing equipment for an army that did not yet exist, building the institutional infrastructure of a defense establishment, while managing a commanding general whose vision for what the Philippine army could achieve was dramatically at odds with the resources available to achieve it. MacArthur was a brilliant theorist of military organization and an appalling manager of practical constraints. He made promises to the Philippine government that the budget could not support, and then expected Eisenhower's staff work to somehow make the impossible possible. It was exhausting, it was frequently infuriating, and it was, in retrospect, exactly the kind of education Eisenhower needed for the role that was eventually to fall to him. Learning to accomplish meaningful work inside a system that combined inadequate resources, impossible expectations, and a commanding officer whose ego complicated every decision. This was precisely the challenge he would face at a vastly larger scale in World War II. The Philippines taught him resilience and adaptability, and the patience to work within frustrating constraints without becoming so frustrated that the work suffered. He also became close, in the Philippines, to the country and its people in ways that stayed with him. Manila in the 1930s was a cosmopolitan and sophisticated city, with a social life that the Eisenhowers participated in actively, and the Filipino culture, its warmth, its complex colonial history, its particular way of negotiating the tensions between traditional customs and modernity, gave Eisenhower a first-hand education in the non-American world that his previous postings had only hinted at. He was becoming, without quite naming it to himself, a genuinely international figure, a man who had lived in Panama, in France, in the Philippines, who had worked alongside people from many cultures and backgrounds and learned how to find common ground with almost anyone. In 1935, MacArthur went to the Philippines to help organize the army of the newly created Philippine Commonwealth, and Eisenhower went with him. 4 years in Manila, in the heat and complexity of the archipelago, helping build a military force from almost nothing, with inadequate resources and impossible timelines, and a commanding general whose ego required careful management at every turn. By the time Eisenhower finally returned to the United States in 1939, he had spent most of his adult life serving others. He was 49 years old. He was still a lieutenant colonel. He had spent 24 years in the army without leading anything larger than a small unit in combat training. The war in Europe had begun. Hitler had invaded Poland. The world was changing, and Eisenhower, patient, prepared, still waiting, could sense that his moment was finally approaching. Before we follow Eisenhower through the extraordinary years that lay ahead, let us pause here, in the quiet middle of his life, and take a longer look at the man himself. Because there are things about Eisenhower that do not come through in accounts of battles and elections, things that are essential to understanding why he was the kind of leader he became. He stood 5 feet 10 inches tall. He had a fair complexion and blue-grey eyes, described by those who encountered him in various accounts as particularly calm, particularly steady, particularly present. His hair had been sandy in youth but was mostly gone by middle age, which gave him that distinctive dome of a forehead that photographers loved and that became as recognizable as the grin. His shoulders were broad and square. His hands were large. He moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had spent years in physical labor and athletics. The grin, of course, defined him visually more than any other feature. Biographer Stephen Ambrose described it as quite fabulous, and this is not overstatement. Photographs from his life convey something of it, but witnesses who saw it in person invariably remark that no photograph quite captured the warmth it communicated. It was not a politician's practiced smile. It was an expression of genuine pleasure in the company of other human beings, of a fundamental sunny disposition that persisted through personal tragedy and professional stress and the weight of commanding the lives of millions of soldiers. He was not naive. He knew the darkness in the world as well as anyone could, but he refused to let the darkness define his interactions with the people around him. He had a fierce temper, carefully controlled. Those who worked with him closely knew it. His staff learned to watch for small signals, a tightening around the jaw, a particular stillness that preceded an explosion, and to manage situations accordingly. But he worked at control with the same deliberateness he applied to everything else, and in most circumstances he succeeded. The lesson from his mother, absorbed on a Halloween night when he was perhaps 8 years old, stayed with him for the rest of his life. Anger was an emotion that consumed its owner. He chose not to be consumed. He played poker with exceptional skill, regularly winning against opponents who should have beaten him. He had a card player's gift for reading people, for seeing past what they presented to what they actually held. This translated directly into his professional life. Contemporaries noted that Eisenhower could walk into a room and within minutes have an accurate read on the dynamics at play, on who was uncomfortable and why, on what the unspoken tensions were, on what people actually meant beneath what they said. This was not manipulation. It was simply a profound attentiveness to human nature. He loved golf with a passion that occasionally frustrated him, because he was not quite as good at it as he wanted to be. He played with the intensity he brought to everything, which is to say, too intensely for a game that requires relaxation. Aides learned that a bad round of golf put the general in a difficult mood, and that a good round produced extraordinary generosity and good humour. He played throughout his life, in his presidency, to some criticism from those who felt a president should be more constantly at his desk, and he maintained that time on the golf course was time when his mind worked differently, when problems that seemed intractable became somehow approachable. Painting was his other great private passion, and here the story is particular. He did not begin painting until 1948, when he was 57 years old, after a chance encounter with the portrait artist Thomas Stevens, who was painting Mamie at the time. Left alone while Stevens and Mamie stepped out of the room, Eisenhower did something impulsive. He picked up the artist's paints and began painting his own version of Mamie's portrait. When Stevens returned, he was charmed rather than offended, and he urged Eisenhower to pursue it seriously. He sent a paint set as a gift a few days later. Eisenhower discovered in painting something that golf couldn't quite give him, a complete absorption that shut out all other thought. He was not a natural artist. He worked at it the way he worked at everything, methodically, with discipline, copying photographs and reproductions until he developed something that could be called a personal style. His landscapes were, in his granddaughter Susan Eisenhower's memorable phrase, very serene. Calm horizons, peaceful skies, fields and rivers that suggested stillness. Consider that he painted these landscapes during one of the most turbulent periods in American history: the Cold War, the Korean War, civil rights confrontations, the constant threat of nuclear catastrophe, and you begin to understand what the painting was doing for him. It was a room of his own inside his mind, where the wars were over and the world was quiet. At home, In private, he liked to cook. He had strong opinions about his chili and his vegetable soup and his beef stew, and he cooked with the same focused attention he gave to military planning. Some of his staff found this surprising. The Supreme Commander of Allied forces with his sleeves rolled up over a pot of stew, but it was entirely consistent with who he was. He was a practical man. He liked to make things. He liked the satisfaction of a concrete result. Mamie ran their domestic life with the efficiency of a woman who'd been managing military households since she was 19 years old. She knew how to make a home out of whatever space was available, how to build social connections in new places, how to manage the endless human logistics of a senior officer's household. She was not particularly interested in policy or politics. She was deeply interested in her husband and her family. The partnership they had built, he managing the public world, she managing their private one, worked because both of them accepted their roles without resentment. He had a remarkable memory, particularly for names and faces. He made a practice, when meeting groups of people, of fixing each person's name and something distinctive about them in his mind, so that when he encountered them again, sometimes years later, he could greet them by name. This was not a trick. It was an expression of his genuine interest in individual human beings, his belief that each person deserved to be seen as an individual rather than as part of an undifferentiated group. Those who experienced it, soldiers he had met once at a field inspection, officials he had spoken to briefly at a conference, were invariably moved by it. The general remembered them. The president knew their name. It sounds like a small thing, but it is not a small thing to be remembered. He had a remarkable capacity for sleep and for compartmentalization, two qualities that, taken together, made him effective in crisis situations where ordinary people would have been paralyzed by anxiety. He could sleep soundly the night before a major military operation. He could set aside a problem that was unresolvable in the current moment and focus on something else, returning to the first problem later with fresh perspective. His staff found this quality simultaneously reassuring and occasionally baffling. How could he sleep before D-Day? He slept because he had done everything that could be done, and worrying through the night would not make the landings more successful. He had a general's relationship with the limits of his own control. He read voraciously throughout his life, military history above all, but also biography and popular fiction. He had a particular weakness for Western novels, the kind featuring cowboys and open ranges and clear moral conflicts between good and evil, and he read them in great quantities without any apparent embarrassment about doing so. Perhaps the flat Kansas landscape of his childhood had never entirely left his imagination, and the Western novel returned him to something essential about how he understood the world. Wide open, morally clear, won through courage and determination. He was, by the testimony of virtually everyone who worked with him, a loyal and considerate boss who gave credit generously and took blame upon himself when things went wrong. He would write his own press releases before D-Day, accepting full responsibility for the invasion's failure if it failed. This was not theatre. It was his deepest conviction about what leadership meant. The people who served under him knew this, and it was one important reason why they followed him. The Louisiana maneuvers of September 1941 changed everything for Dwight Eisenhower. The Army had organized its largest peacetime military exercises in American history, a massive simulation involving hundreds of thousands of troops spread across the bayous and flatlands of Louisiana, intended to test the readiness of the American military in a world that was obviously on the edge of global war. Eisenhower, by this point serving as Chief of Staff of the Third Army, was responsible for coordinating the movements of hundreds of thousands of men, planning supply lines and communications and troop movements across a vast and complex terrain. The logistics alone were staggering. He performed brilliantly. His Third Army won the maneuvers decisively, outmaneuvering their opponents through superior planning and communication and the kind of flexibility that comes from a commander who has thought through contingencies in advance and trained his staff to adapt. The senior observers were impressed. One of them was General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff and the man who would, within 3 months, become the most important single figure in organizing the American military response to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Marshall saw in Eisenhower what many others had noted for years but had not been positioned to act upon. Here was a man of extraordinary organizational intelligence, exceptional interpersonal skill, and the kind of steady temperament that high command demanded. After Pearl Harbor, Marshall called Eisenhower to Washington. Within 6 months, Eisenhower had been promoted to Major General and placed in charge of planning for the American intervention in Europe. The rise from that point was almost vertiginous. In June 1942, he was commanding American forces in Europe. In November 1942, he commanded the Allied invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch. In July 1943, he commanded the invasion of Sicily. In September 1943, the invasion of Italy. Each operation had its difficulties, its critics, its moments of near failure. Each one also demonstrated the qualities that made Eisenhower uniquely suited to the role he was being asked to play. For Eisenhower's most essential skill was not purely military. It was the management of extraordinarily difficult people in service of a common goal. The Allied coalition contained some of the most temperamental, egotistical, and individually brilliant military figures of the 20th century. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, French General Charles de Gaulle, American General George S. Patton, among dozens of others, and these men disagreed with each other constantly, competed with each other obsessively, and sometimes seemed as interested in their personal glory as in the defeat of Nazi Germany. Keeping them working together, or at least pointing in the same direction, required a kind of diplomatic genius that Eisenhower possessed, and few others did. He did it through a combination of genuine warmth, iron patience, quiet authority, and the unshakable conviction that the mission mattered more than anyone's ego, including his own. When Montgomery was being impossible, which was frequently, Eisenhower found ways to redirect rather than confront. When Patton was being reckless, which was nearly constant, Eisenhower deployed him where his recklessness was useful and managed the political fallout of his excesses. When de Gaulle was being imperious about French sovereignty, always, Eisenhower navigated the diplomatic shoals with a steadiness that Roosevelt and Churchill, both of whom found de Gaulle maddening, privately admired. Then came Overlord. In December 1943, at the Tehran Conference, where Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin were meeting, Stalin demanded a name for the Supreme Allied Commander for the planned invasion of France. Roosevelt had been inclined toward Marshall, his indispensable Army Chief of Staff, but he found that he could not bear to part with Marshall in Washington. He considered the options and made his decision. He called Eisenhower to him and spoke with characteristically casual directness. "Well, Ike, you are going to command Overlord." With those 9 words, the stage was set. Eisenhower arrived in England in January 1944 and began planning an operation of a scale that had never been attempted in human history. The plan called for landing approximately 160,000 men on a 50-mile stretch of heavily fortified French coastline in a single day, supported by more than 5,000 ships and 13,000 aircraft. The beaches had been chosen carefully, Normandy, rather than the Pas-de-Calais, which was more obvious and therefore more heavily defended, and the German military had been deceived through an elaborate program of disinformation into believing the attack would come elsewhere. Months of work went into every detail. The supply chains, the timing, the weather windows, the naval bombardment schedules, the paratroop deployments, the arrangements for keeping the deception operative until the very last moment. Eisenhower visited 26 divisions, 24 airfields, 5 ships, and dozens of other military installations in the weeks before the invasion, meeting as many of his men as physically possible. He went not as an inspecting general looking for salutes, but as a commander who understood that the men who would cross those beaches needed to see the man who had ordered them there. He smiled and shook hands and listened to concerns and joked with the soldiers, and everywhere he went he left behind something that his chief of staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, would later describe as simple and incalculable. Trust. The men trusted Ike. The original invasion date was June 5th, 1944. The weather intervened. A storm swept across the English Channel, making an amphibious assault suicidal. Eisenhower postponed for 24 hours, watching the weather reports with the focused attention of a man who understood that every additional day of waiting increased the risk that the German military would discover the invasion plans. On the night of June 4th, in a meeting at Southwick House near Portsmouth, he listened to his chief meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg, describe a narrow window of slightly improved conditions, not good weather, but better. Eisenhower sat quietly for a long moment. Then he said simply, "Okay, we'll go." Those 4 words launched the largest military operation in history. On the evening of June 5th, 1944, Eisenhower did something that reveals everything essential about him. He visited the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division who were about to board their aircraft for the night drop behind German lines. These men would be jumping into darkness over occupied France, hours before the beaches were assaulted, to secure vital positions that the success of the landings depended upon. Their casualties were expected to be catastrophic. Eisenhower walked among them, talking with them, looking them in the eyes. He would later admit that he could barely maintain his composure. He had written a message accepting complete responsibility for the failure of the invasion if it failed. He had stared at that message, folded it, and put it in his pocket, and gone to see the men who would die carrying out his orders. Then he watched the planes take off into the dark and he went back to headquarters to wait. June 6th, 1944, D-Day. The assault began in the pre-dawn darkness, with paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropping behind German lines to secure critical road junctions and bridges. Then came the naval bombardment, and then, as the grey light of a cloudy June morning began to illuminate the French coast, the landing craft hit the beaches in waves. At Utah Beach, the American assault went relatively well. An unexpected drift of current carried the first landing craft to a section of beach that was more lightly defended than the planned target, and the troops moved quickly inland. At Gold, Juno and Sword beaches, the British and Canadian forces fought hard and took serious casualties, but established their beachheads. At Omaha Beach, the American assault nearly failed. Omaha was the most heavily defended of the 5 beaches. The bluffs above it gave German defenders commanding positions from which they could fire down into the landing craft and the troops struggling through the surf. The initial bombardment had been inaccurate. The amphibious tanks, intended to provide armoured support to the infantry, had been launched too far out and most had sunk in the rough seas. The men of the first waves landed without tank support, under withering fire, in a situation that had no good options. They were being killed in the surf, they were being killed on the beach, they were being killed at the base of the bluffs. For several hours, the situation at Omaha was desperate enough that senior American naval commanders were discussing whether to abandon the beach entirely and redirect forces to Utah. But the American infantryman, the individual soldier, making individual decisions under fire, refused to stop. Small groups found ways through the German defences. Sergeants and lieutenants and private soldiers took initiative where the plan had broken down and found paths up the bluffs that the Germans had not fully covered. By mid-morning, the breakthrough was beginning. By afternoon, Omaha was secured. The cost was enormous. Exact casualties on D-Day are still debated by historians, but estimates of killed, wounded, and missing across all 5 beaches range from 10,000 to more than 12,000 Allied casualties, with American losses accounting for perhaps 6,000 of those. Omaha Beach alone may have cost 2,000 American lives. Eisenhower received the reports through the day in his command post. He had written the message accepting responsibility for failure and put it in his pocket. He did not need to send it, but the knowledge of the cost, the knowledge that he had sent those men to those beaches, that his decisions and his plan had determined who lived and who died, stayed with him for the rest of his life. He never spoke of D-Day with the triumphalism that some later accounts applied to it. He spoke of it with the gravity of a man who understood exactly what it had cost. By day's end, nearly 160,000 Allied troops had landed on the Normandy beaches. The cost was enormous. Thousands of dead, wounded and missing, with the heaviest losses on Omaha Beach, where the American assault came within a whisker of catastrophic failure. But the foothold had been established. By the end of June, nearly 1 million Allied troops had landed in France. By August, Paris was liberated. By May of 1945, Nazi Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was won. Eisenhower had not won it alone. No one wins a war of that scale alone. But he had done the singular thing that no one else could have done. He had held the Allied coalition together through 2 years of extraordinarily difficult operations, managed the enormous egos and conflicting national interests of a dozen nations, and delivered the coordinated military effort that defeated the most powerful military machine Europe had ever produced. When V-Day came, the world celebrated, and among all the celebrations none was more heartfelt than in Abilene, Kansas, where people who had known the Eisenhower boys gathered and thought about the boy who had sold vegetables door to door and worked overnight shifts at the creamery and gone away to West Point because it was the only education he could afford. "The proudest thing I can claim," Eisenhower had once said, "is that I am from Abilene." The years between the end of World War II and Eisenhower's presidency were not as straightforward as the myth of inevitable triumph might suggest. They were years of considerable ambiguity and occasional struggle, as the most celebrated general in American history tried to figure out what came next. He was appointed Army Chief of Staff in November 1945, an administrative role he found less satisfying than field command. He retired from active duty in 1948 and became president of Columbia University in New York, a position for which he had no particular academic preparation, and which he found, frankly, not entirely suited to his temperament. He was a man of action and decision, not a man comfortable with the slow rhythms of academic administration and faculty governance. But his real work in these years was not at Columbia. It was in Europe, where the post-war order was crystallizing into something new and alarming. The Soviet Union, which had been America's ally in the war against Hitler, was now emerging as a rival of extraordinary scale and ideological ferocity. The question of how to respond to Soviet expansion in Europe dominated Western governments. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was established in 1949 as the institutional framework for Western collective defense. In 1951, at the specific request of President Truman, Eisenhower left Colombia to become the first Supreme Allied Commander of NATO in Paris. He served there for over a year, doing what he had done before, managing a coalition of nations with conflicting interests, pushing them toward a common defensive posture, using his extraordinary personal credibility as the man who had led the alliance to victory against Hitler, to persuade, cajole, and inspire cooperation. He was good at it. He was always good at it. Meanwhile, the question of the 1952 presidential election was building toward a crescendo. Both political parties wanted Eisenhower. His popularity was genuine and enormous. The polls consistently showed that large majorities of Americans trusted him, liked him, believed he would do the right thing. The Democrats made overtures. The Republicans made overtures. Eisenhower characteristically took a long time to decide, and when he decided, he chose the Republicans, partly out of conviction about the direction of American foreign policy, partly because he believed a two-party system required competitive elections, and the Democrats had held the White House for 20 years. He ran in 1952 under the slogan, "I like Ike," one of the most effective campaign slogans in American political history precisely because it was so simple and so true. People did like Ike. They liked his honesty and his directness and his big grin. They liked the idea of a man who had demonstrated under the most extreme possible circumstances that he was steady and competent and trustworthy. He defeated Adlai Stevenson decisively in November 1952, and on January 20th, 1953, Dwight David Eisenhower became the 34th President of the United States. The transition from military commander to elected civilian president required adjustments that Eisenhower made more smoothly than his critics expected. He had spent his career in institutions with clear chains of command, where orders moved downward and results moved upward, and the hierarchy was unambiguous. The American political system was nothing like this. It was a complex organism of competing interests, constitutional constraints, congressional power, judicial independence, public opinion, and the relentless pressure of a free press. Eisenhower had watched politics from the outside for decades and had formed precise views about what it required and what it corrupted. Now he was inside it. He assembled a cabinet of accomplished people, not personal loyalists but successful figures from business and the law and public service who brought real expertise to their positions. He relied on them for their areas of specialization while maintaining his own clear authority over the directions that mattered most to him: foreign policy, defense, fiscal discipline, and the broad shape of American strategy in the Cold War. He was not a micromanager. He had learned, in the army and specifically in coalition command, that a leader who tried to control every detail ended up controlling none of them well. He set direction, established expectations, built and maintained trust with key subordinates, and left the implementation to people whose judgment he had vetted. The critics who mistook this approach for passivity were making an error about what leadership actually looks like at the highest levels of responsibility. The visible moments of drama, the speech, the press conference, the public confrontation, represent a small fraction of what governing actually involves. The larger fraction is invisible: the meetings that didn't happen publicly, the decisions that were made before they became public, the quiet management of situations that never became crises because they were handled before they reached that point. Eisenhower was a master of this invisible governance, and it was only years later, when historians gained access to his private papers, and the records of his administration that the full picture of his engagement and his judgment became apparent. His first foreign policy achievement came quickly. He had promised during the campaign to visit Korea, where American forces had been fighting a grinding, costly, inconclusive war since 1950. He went, as promised, in December 1952 before taking office. And within 6 months of his inauguration, the Korean War armistice was signed, ending the active fighting. He had used his military credibility and his quiet warnings, conveyed through diplomatic channels, that he was prepared to use nuclear weapons if the war continued, to push the negotiations toward a conclusion. For the first time in 3 years, American boys stopped dying in Korea. His presidency was in many ways a study in what one historian has called hidden hand governance, the art of accomplishing things without seeming to act, of managing outcomes while publicly maintaining an air of affable, golf-playing aloofness. Some contemporaries mistook this for passivity. Historians examining the actual record of his administration have concluded almost unanimously that the passivity was largely performance. He was deeply engaged in the decisions of his presidency, often working late into the night on problems that his public demeanour suggested were barely on his radar. The domestic achievement that most durably shaped American life was the Interstate Highway System. In 1956, Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, which committed the federal government to building a network of interconnected highways across the entire country. Eventually, 46,000 miles of roads connecting every major city and most medium-sized ones. The idea had several fathers, but Eisenhower's enthusiasm for it was deeply personal. He had driven across the country on the Lincoln Highway in 1919, a convoy exercise that took 62 days and demonstrated how badly inadequate American roads were. He had seen the German Autobahn system during the war and understood what good roads did for military mobility. He now understood what they would do for economic activity and national unity. The Interstate Highway System remains one of the largest public works projects in human history and one of the most consequential decisions of his presidency. He also oversaw the establishment of NASA in response to the Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957. He expanded Social Security. He signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the first federal civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, though he was more cautious on civil rights than his admirers wished he would be, and his response to the Supreme Court school desegregation decision was slower than the moment demanded. When the governor of Arkansas used the National Guard to prevent black students from entering Little Rock Central High School in defiance of the court order, Eisenhower acted with force and swiftness. He sent the 101st Airborne Division, the same unit whose paratroopers he had watched board their aircraft on the night of June 5, 1944, to enforce federal law and protect the students. He had no desire for the confrontation and handled the politics awkwardly, but when the moment required action, he acted. The confrontation at Little Rock in 1957 illustrated both the limitations and the ultimate firmness of Eisenhower's approach to civil rights. When Arkansas Governor Orville Forbes used the National Guard to block 9 black students from entering Central High School, he was defying not just the principle of integration, but a direct order of the federal courts. While Eisenhower had been deeply reluctant to use federal force to implement school desegregation, he believed in gradualism, in changing minds rather than compelling behavior, and he was personally dubious that federal intervention could win the hearts and minds that genuine integration required. These were not entirely wrong concerns, but the governor had directly defied the law and that Eisenhower could not permit. He federalized the Arkansas National Guard, removing it from the governor's control, and sent the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock. The same paratroopers who had dropped behind German lines on the night before D-Day, or their successors in that tradition, now walked the halls of a high school in Arkansas to ensure that 9 teenagers could attend their classes without being turned away by the state. It was an imperfect response to an imperfect situation, and Eisenhower's public statements about it were more halting and equivocal than they should have been. But he did it. When the moment required him to choose between the principle of federal law and the political convenience of backing down, he chose the law. His handling of Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist crusade was less admirable, and most historians agree on this. McCarthy's reckless accusations had by 1953 created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that damaged innocent people and poisoned public discourse. Eisenhower privately despised McCarthy, considered him a demagogue and a liar, and found his methods repugnant. But he was deeply reluctant to confront McCarthy publicly, believing that to do so would only elevate the senator and give him a larger stage. He chose instead to work quietly behind the scenes, encouraging others to challenge McCarthy while maintaining his own public distance from the dispute. The strategy eventually worked. McCarthy destroyed himself, as demagogues eventually tend to do, and Eisenhower's restraint meant that the president had not been drawn into a public brawl with a man who specialized in public brawling. But the cost of the approach was real. Innocent people suffered during the years Eisenhower chose not to act, and the silence of the most trusted figure in American public life gave a kind of tacit legitimacy to a process that deserved explicit condemnation. This was a failure of moral courage in a presidency that otherwise demonstrated moral courage consistently. On the foreign policy front, he navigated the most volatile phase of the Cold War without losing, as he put it, a single soldier or a single foot of American soil. He resisted enormous pressure from hawks in both political parties to escalate American military commitments in various hotspots around the globe. He was not a pacifist. He believed in military strength as the foundation of credible deterrence, but he understood, better than almost anyone, the actual costs of military action, and he was extraordinarily reluctant to pay those costs unless absolutely necessary. The doctrine of massive retaliation, the threat of nuclear response to Soviet aggression, was partly a strategy for avoiding conventional war, and it worked after a fashion in keeping the Cold War cold. On January 17, 1961, 3 days before he left office, Dwight Eisenhower sat before the television cameras in the Oval Office one final time and delivered what would become the most famous speech of his presidency, and perhaps one of the most famous speeches in American history. He had been working on the farewell address for more than a year. His brother Milton and several speechwriters had contributed drafts, but the essential ideas were Eisenhower's own, the product of 8 years of watching, from the most intimate possible vantage point, how the relationship between the military establishment and the defense industry was reshaping American government and American society. The speech covered many themes: the importance of balance in all things, the dangers of deficit spending, the need for scientific and educational investment, the responsibility of each generation to the next. But it was one particular warning that would echo down through the decades and into our own time. He said that the conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry was new in the American experience. He said that the total influence of this conjunction, economic, political, even spiritual, was felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. And then he said the words that would be quoted and requoted for the next 60 years. In the councils of government, We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The man who had commanded the largest military coalition in history, who had spent his entire adult life in the army, who had overseen the largest peacetime military build-up in American history, was warning his country against the danger of militarism. Not because he thought defense was unnecessary, but because he understood, from the inside with the clarity of someone who had watched it happen in real time, how the institutional interests of the military and the financial interests of defense contractors could combine into something that was no longer simply about defending the country, something that could distort priorities, capture budgets, and influence policy in ways that served the institution rather than the nation. He had wanted to add another phrase, military-industrial congressional complex, but had been persuaded to remove the reference to Congress for political reasons. The warning, even incomplete, was prescient. The decades after his departure would validate it repeatedly. He left office on January 20th, 1961, when John F. Kennedy was inaugurated. He drove with Kennedy from the White House to the Capitol, the old general and the young president, and then he handed over the responsibilities he had carried for 8 years and retired, at the age of 70, to the farm he and Mamie had bought in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the first home they had ever actually owned. The farm at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, was everything the Eisenhowers needed and had never quite had before. A real home, with fields and gardens and space for grandchildren to run. Not an army post or a hotel or a university president's residence, but their own place, with their names on the deed, filled with furniture they had chosen in a landscape that Eisenhower loved for its history and its rolling beauty. He had bought it in 1950 during his Columbia years, and they had renovated it while he was in Europe with NATO. By the time he actually moved in as a retired man in January 1961, it was warm and comfortable and deeply theirs. Mamie had finally unpacked permanently. The moving was over. Eisenhower wrote his memoirs, 2 volumes about his White House years, serious and carefully composed. He wrote At Ease, Stories I Tell to Friends, a more personal memoir that became a bestseller and gave readers a glimpse of the Ike behind the general and the president. He painted. He golfed. He raised cattle on the farm with the same methodical attention he had given to more consequential enterprises. He grew flowers in the garden and visited his grandchildren, and kept up an enormous correspondence with figures from every phase of his life. He remained a significant figure in Republican politics, consulted and courted and publicly respected, though he was careful to maintain a distance from partisan disputes. He endorsed Nixon in 1960, somewhat lukewarmly it must be said, and watched his former vice president lose narrowly to Kennedy. He watched Kennedy navigate the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 with the private satisfaction of a man who had counseled the new president on the Cuban situation before the inauguration. He watched the escalation of Vietnam with increasing discomfort. Nixon came to Gettysburg regularly to see the former president seeking advice and blessing. Eisenhower's granddaughter Julie fell in love with Nixon's son David, a development that gave both men considerable private pleasure and created a dynastic connection between the families that seemed to suit both. When David Eisenhower married Julie Nixon in December 1968, the former president was there, already in the Walter Reed Hospital by then, but still present in the world, still aware of what was happening around him. He had suffered his first major heart attack in September 1955, on the anniversary of Icky's birthday, a date that was already laden with private grief. Mamie saved him, in a quite literal sense, by wrapping herself around him to calm him before the ambulance arrived. He recovered, But the heart attack was a signal that the extraordinary physical vitality of his earlier years was being spent. More attacks followed, at intervals, 1956-1965. Each time he recovered. Each time the recovery was harder. He remained engaged with the world. He gave speeches and interviews and wrote articles. He was consulted by Republican politicians and by presidents. Kennedy, after the Bay of Pigs disaster, came to Gettysburg to debrief with the former president, and Eisenhower was measured but pointed in his assessment of how the operation had been mismanaged. He watched the Cuban Missile Crisis with the close attention of someone who had spent 8 years managing exactly this kind of nuclear-age confrontation, and had strong opinions about the right approach. He watched the escalation in Vietnam with increasing concern, believing that the commitment being made there was not matched by a clear strategic objective or an exit strategy. The kinds of problems that a military man who had planned Overlord and managed the complexity of coalition warfare recognized immediately as signs of institutional confusion. He kept his correspondence going with an energy that surprised those who thought retirement would mellow him into passivity. Letters to old colleagues from the war years, letters to friends from his Abilene childhood, letters to historians and scholars who were beginning to assess his legacy, letters to ordinary Americans who wrote to him about his time in office. He answered them with care, taking the correspondence seriously as an obligation of the public role he had played. The Gettysburg farm was a genuine pleasure. He managed it with the same methodical attention he gave to everything, investing in the cattle herd, overseeing the land management, making improvements to the house and grounds. For the first time in his life, he had a place that was entirely his own, not borrowed quarters, not official residences, but a real property with his name attached to it, that he could shape according to his own vision. It was a modest pleasure for a man of his accomplishments, but it was a real one. He remained active outdoors as long as his health permitted, walking the fields, watching the seasons change over the Pennsylvania countryside. The landscape around Gettysburg was not the flat Kansas plains he had grown up on, but it had its own kind of beauty. Rolling hills, old stone farmhouses, the particular quality of light in that part of Pennsylvania that painters have been trying to capture for centuries. He painted some of it himself, in the serene, calm style that his granddaughter would later describe as utterly unlike the world he was actually living in. His final years narrowed around his health. The heart that had beat steadily through the North Africa landings and the Normandy planning and the Korean armistice negotiations and 8 years of Cold War management was wearing out. He was hospitalized at Walter Reed in May 1968, following another serious attack, and he never left the hospital again. The last 9 months of his life were spent in that ward, with Mamie visiting daily, with old friends and family coming and going, with the news of the world filtering in through television and newspapers. He remained mentally sharp almost to the end. He watched the 1968 election return Nixon to power with satisfaction. He saw his grandson marry Julie Nixon. He followed events with the focused attention of a man who'd been at the center of the world's most consequential decisions and could not quite stop caring about the outcome of things. As winter became spring in 1969, Eisenhower's condition deteriorated steadily. He had survived multiple heart attacks, multiple surgeries, multiple episodes that the doctors described as critical. Each time the announcement came that he was in serious condition, the world held its breath, and each time he recovered, partially incompletely, but enough to continue. But the March of 1969 was different. Even his most devoted medical team knew that the machinery was finally running down. His mind remained clear. The things he said in those final weeks were consistent with everything he had always been. Direct, practical, concerned for those around him rather than himself. He worried about Mamie. He asked after old friends and colleagues. He wanted to know about David and Julie, about John and his family, about the farm and whether the cattle were being properly managed. He did not seem to be afraid. This was noted by nurses and family members and attending physicians, all of whom remarked upon the quality of calm that he brought to his own dying. He had spent his life planning for contingencies, accepting that some things were beyond control, doing his best and then accepting the results. He applied the same philosophy to the end of his own life that he had applied to everything else. Manage what can be managed, accept what cannot be changed, and maintain your composure in the meantime. On March 28, 1969, when it was clear that the end was very near, he gathered what remained of his strength and made his final dispositions with the same deliberateness that had characterized every major decision of his life. He asked the doctors and nurses to lower the shades against the spring light. He asked to be raised to a sitting position. He took Mamie's hand and held it. He looked at his son John. He looked at his grandson David. And then he spoke, quietly and clearly, his last recorded words, "I want to go. God take me." He died at 12:25 in the afternoon. The announcement was made by Brigadier General Frederick Hughes, commanding general of Walter Reed, who said that Eisenhower had died quietly after a long and heroic struggle, and that he had died peacefully. President Nixon, who arrived at the hospital shortly after Eisenhower's death, paid his tribute to the man under whom he had served as vice president for 8 years. Nixon would later share what he described as Eisenhower's final words to Mamie, expressing his love for her, his family, and his country. The nation's response was immediate and profound. Flags went to half-staff. Tributes came from heads of state around the world. The generation that had grown up during the war and built their adult lives during the Eisenhower years felt the loss as something personal. The passing of a man who had, for many of them, represented something they found difficult to articulate, but recognized instantly as steadiness. He had been there when they needed him, and now he was gone. The state funeral began on March 29th, when the body was taken to the Washington National Cathedral, where it lay in repose for 28 hours while the public filed past the casket. On March 30th, a solemn procession carried the casket down Constitution Avenue to the Capitol Rotunda, where Nixon delivered the eulogy. On March 31st, the Episcopal funeral service was held at the cathedral. Then the casket was placed on a train. The train carried Eisenhower home to Kansas. It arrived in Abilene on April 2, 1969. The final service was held on the grounds of the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum, the institution built on the land he had loved since childhood, in the town where he had grown up poor and hopeful and hard-working. The service began on the steps of the library and concluded inside the place of meditation, a small chapel of quiet simplicity where Eisenhower was buried. He was buried beside the grave of his firstborn son, Icky, the son who had wanted a tricycle for Christmas and had died at 3 years old on the 2nd of January in 1921. Father and son together finally, in the Kansas soil they had both come from, not far from the house on South 4th Street where 6 boys had shared a bedroom and a mother had read the Bible by lamplight and taught them that hatred was a waste of a life. The inscription on the marker is plain: Dwight D. Eisenhower born, October 14th, 1890, died, March 28th, 1969. No titles, no rank, no list of achievements, just the dates that contained a life. The legacy of Dwight Eisenhower is larger than most people realize and differently shaped than common memory suggests. The Interstate Highway System alone would secure his place in American history. Before the Interstate Highway Act of 1956, traveling from one end of the country to the other required navigating a patchwork of state roads, many of them inadequate for modern traffic. The interstate system changed everything. It enabled the post-war suburban expansion, made national commerce vastly more efficient, connected communities that had been relationally and economically isolated, and created the physical infrastructure upon which much of modern American life depends. Nearly every road trip, every truck delivery, every daily commute along a controlled access highway in the United States happens on roads that exist because Eisenhower saw their necessity and had the political will to build them. The system cost more than $114 billion in its original construction. Its economic benefits have been calculated in the trillions. NASA was his creation, in the sense that it was Eisenhower who signed the legislation establishing the Civilian Space Agency in 1958, following the shock of Sputnik. He was not particularly enthusiastic about the space race. He thought it was partly theatre and was resistant to dramatic spending on programs he considered scientifically dubious. But he understood that the United States needed a civilian space capability separate from the military, and he built the institutional framework within which the Apollo program would eventually land men on the moon. Eisenhower was born the year the frontier closed and died the year man walked on the moon. The distance between those two events, measured in human striving, is almost incomprehensible, and he stood at the center of it. The Civil Rights Act of 1957, though modest by comparison with the legislation that would follow in the 1960s, was the first federal civil rights law in 82 years. It established the Civil Rights Commission and gave the federal government tools to protect voting rights. Eisenhower's record on civil rights was complicated. He was personally skeptical of using federal power aggressively in this area, and he was slower to act than the moment demanded. But he did act. He sent troops to Little Rock. He signed the legislation. He appointed Earl Warren to the Supreme Court, which led directly to Brown versus Board of Education, the decision that would set the trajectory of the civil rights movement for the next generation. His appointments and actions had consequences he may not have fully intended, but those consequences were real. His handling of the early Cold War offers its own lesson in restraint as wisdom. The years from 1953 to 1961 were not quiet years in international affairs. The Korean armistice held, but barely. Crises erupted in Indochina, in the Suez, in Lebanon, in the Taiwan Strait, in Hungary. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik. The U-2 spy plane was shot down over Soviet territory in 1960, destroying the summit meeting Eisenhower had worked toward with Khrushchev. At every point there were voices, some in the military, some in Congress, some in the press, urging more aggressive action, more military commitment, more willingness to use American power. Eisenhower resisted nearly all of these pressures with the calm stubbornness of a man who'd actually seen war and was under no illusions about what it cost. He lost the U-2 summit. He failed to prevent the communist consolidation in North Vietnam that would eventually draw American forces into a devastating conflict under his successors. He was not perfect, and the world he handed to Kennedy was not a solved world. But he kept the peace for 8 years, maintained the solvency of the federal government despite enormous defense pressures, and handed to his successor a country that was stronger, more prosperous, and more stable than the one he had inherited. His warning about the military-industrial complex has proven, in the decades since he delivered it, to be one of the most accurate predictions in American political history. The defense establishment he warned against has only grown more powerful, more entrenched, more intertwined with the political process. Successive presidents and congresses have struggled, with varying degrees of success, with exactly the dynamic he identified, the way that institutional interests in maintaining and expanding military expenditure can distort national priorities in ways that serve the institution rather than the nation. When his farewell address is cited, and it is cited constantly across political lines by people with very different agendas, it is cited precisely because it named something real. The man who had spent his entire adult life in uniform, who commanded the greatest military force in history, warned against military overreach. That warning was not the product of naivety. It was the product of intimate knowledge. His reputation has gone through the cycles that most historical figures experience. Celebrated in his time, somewhat diminished in the immediate aftermath as a new generation defined itself against his apparent conservatism, then gradually reassessed as historians looked more carefully at what he actually did and found behind the affable surface, a record of considerable substance. He consistently ranks among the upper tier of American presidents in scholarly assessments, typically placed in the range just below the greatest and well above the average. He maintained peace. He presided over prosperity. He built things that lasted. He warned against dangers that proved real. He governed with steady judgment in a world that was threatening to come apart. What he showed, in the end, was that the kind of leadership the world needed in the mid-20th century was not the most dramatic kind. Not the thunderous oratory of Churchill, not the aristocratic brilliance of de Gaulle, not the charismatic transformation of Roosevelt. What it needed was steadiness, the ability to hold a coalition together when all the forces of ego and national interest were pulling it apart, the ability to make the right decision under extreme pressure and then accept whatever came, the ability to project confidence without being consumed by it, to maintain optimism without denying reality, to lead without needing the world to notice you leading. He was a Kansas farm boy who grew up to command the armies of the free world and then warned that same world about the dangers of over-relying on armies. He was the son of a pacifist mother who became the man most responsible for the military victory that preserved democracy in the 20th century. He was the child of poverty who occupied the most powerful office in the world and then retired to a farm in Gettysburg and raised cattle and painted landscapes, and was happy. He had a grin that could light up a room. He loved his wife with the consistent, undemonstrative, thoroughly reliable loyalty of a Kansas man who did not say much about feelings, but expressed them in yellow roses every September. He wept, privately, completely, over the death of a 3-year-old boy who never got to ride his tricycle. And he carried that grief for the remaining 48 years of his life without letting it become the whole of his story. He rose from nothing. He accomplished everything that was asked of him, and several things that had never been asked of anyone before. And then he went home to Kansas, where he'd always belonged, and the plains received him back. Tonight, somewhere in America, a family is driving on Interstate 70 through the Kansas flatlands, watching the sun go down over a horizon so wide and so flat and so still that it seems to contain everything and nothing simultaneously. They may or may not know whose idea it was to build the road they're driving on. They may or may not think about Abilene, which is just off that highway, where a small museum and a small chapel sit on a quiet piece of ground and mark the beginning and end of an extraordinary life. Somewhere a driver passes through Abilene and doesn't stop and doesn't know, and somewhere a visitor does stop and walks the grounds of the Eisenhower Center and stands in the place of meditation and reads the plain stone marker. Born October 14th, 1890. Died March 28th, 1969. The dates of a life that began in poverty in a house by the railroad tracks in Texas and ended having helped determine the shape of the world. Just the dates. Nothing else is needed because everything else is already known. There is another way to measure Eisenhower's legacy, one that neither the historians nor the policy analysts tend to emphasize: the simple fact of his availability. He was there when he was needed. This sounds like a minimal standard, but history is littered with examples of people who were not there, who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, who lacked the specific combination of qualities that a specific moment demanded. Eisenhower happened to be alive, happened to be in the American Army, happened to come of professional age in the period between the world wars, happened to come under the influence of Fox Connor at exactly the right moment, happened to develop precisely the skills of coalition management and patient planning that the job of Supreme Allied Commander required. A great deal had to go right for Eisenhower to be Eisenhower. He was grateful for this, and said so in various forms throughout his life. He was a man of genuine humility, not the performed humility of the politician, but the real humility of someone who understands the role that chance plays in even the most distinguished careers. What he brought to the role that was uniquely his, the thing that no amount of good fortune could have substituted for, was character. Character in the old-fashioned sense, the aggregation of habits and values and practice self-discipline that determine how a person behaves when no one is looking and when everything is on the line. The willingness to sit down and write a message accepting full responsibility for the failure of the Normandy landings before the landings had even happened was an act of character. The willingness, as president, to send federal troops to enforce the law even when it was politically costly was an act of character. The willingness in his farewell address to warn against the very institutional forces he had spent his career commanding was an act of character. He was not without flaws. His record on civil rights was more cautious than history demands, his response to McCarthyism more passive than the moment warranted, his management of American interventions in other countries, Guatemala, Iran, more willing to use covert power than his stated values of democracy and self-determination would suggest. He was a man of his time and his class, with all the limitations those categories implied. The full picture of his presidency, when historians examined it honestly, contained shadows alongside the achievements. But he tried, within those limitations, to do what he believed was right. He tried to protect the country without bankrupting it, to maintain peace without abandoning the credible deterrents that made peace possible, to use the enormous power of the American presidency without becoming intoxicated by it. He tried, and more often than not he succeeded. There is something deeply American in the Eisenhower story, and something that transcends nationality. The idea that a person of modest origins, through preparation and patience and the willingness to do whatever job was in front of them with full attention and full effort, might end up doing something that matters. The idea that steadiness, over time, accomplishes things that brilliance alone cannot. The idea that the most important quality in a leader might not be the most dramatic one, not the thunderous speech or the bold gesture or the transformative vision, but simply the ability to hold things together, to keep the coalition functioning, to maintain the direction when everything is pulling toward chaos. Eisenhower himself would have been suspicious of eloquent summaries of his life. He was a practical man. He would have wanted to know, did it work? Were the beaches taken? Was the war won? Was the country more prosperous, more peaceful, more stable than it had been when he arrived? Did the roads get built? Did the soldiers come home? The answers, by the measures he would have recognized, were yes. He was, as he said himself, a man from Abilene, and from Abilene to the command of Allied forces in World War II, from the Kansas plains to the Oval Office, from the boy who sold vegetables door to door to the general who planned D-Day and warned a nation about the dangers of its own power, from all of that to the simple stone marker in the Kansas soil. It was, in the end, a thoroughly American life, and a remarkable one. Sleep well tonight. The world that Dwight Eisenhower helped to build and to protect is still here. The highways he built stretch across it. The peace he maintained for 8 years gave a generation a chance to grow up without war. The warning he issued still echoes in the councils of power for those who choose to listen. And out on the Kansas plains, where the horizon goes on forever and the sky's enormous and the grass moves in a way that reminds you of the ocean, the land is exactly as it was when a boy named Ike first learned to read it. The same flatness, the same light, the same endless, quiet, American sky. Thank you for spending this time with Dwight Eisenhower's story. If you found something in this account that moved you or made you think, I hope you'll carry it with you. And I hope, wherever you are tonight, that you are comfortable and warm, and that sleep comes to you easily. Until next time, good night.